on All Change, the digital revolution and the fate of humanity. He is a British political advisor who is known for his theory of structuration and his historic view of modern societies, which explores the connections between individuals and the social system. He is the author of at least 34 books, published in at least 29 languages. He is also a former director of the London School of Economics, Life Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and a member of the House of Lords in the UK.
You're supposed to go bong. Well, can I say thank you very much? Can you hear me? I say thank you very much to Kat for that elegant introduction. And I'd like to thank Brian for inviting me. Thank the SPS, is it a faculty? Yeah. SPS for inviting me too. And congratulate the members of staff on all their achievements, because it's a very high status subject, social sciences at York. York's a very desirable university, so you should all be bloody pleased to be here. Mind you, I hope some of you come to the LSE when you graduate. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this lecture is transformation. I want to argue that we're living through a period of possibly the greatest technological transformation ever in human history. I don't think this is hyperbole. We're living through a period of change probably like no other. The driving force of these technological innovations is the digital revolution, and that is the core of what I want to discuss. There has never been a period of change quite like this one in terms of its global scope, its speed, and probably also its depth. And I think almost certainly we're only in the first few years of the digital revolution. Most of you sitting here will live out your lives wrestling with the consequences, really, of what I'm going to talk about. Let me just give you a couple of examples to show why the nature of what's happening doesn't have any real precedent in the past. The first is the advent of the internet itself. The best analogue I can think of for the coming of the internet is the invention of writing, which happened something like 20,000 years ago. When writing was first invented, it took another 10,000 years before it percolated even to a few people, because throughout most of history, most people were not literate. And so this was a slow evolving process that transformed the emerging civilizations. But you compare it to the internet. Depending on how you date it, the internet is no more at most than 30 years old. And it's gone straight to the rest of the world. Our lives, your personal lives, my personal life, our everyday activities integrated with global futures in a way that has never ever happened before and never could happen before. This is a really remarkable, extraordinary phenomenon, which as social scientists we must seek to grapple with the implications of this. Let me give you a second example. When the telephone was first invented in the 19th century, it took 75 years to reach 50 million people. The first iPhone was only invented in 2007, and smartphones in general are only a few years older than that. Today, believe it or not, there are something like 2 billion smartphones in the world, and 3 billion, maybe 4 billion, no one is sure, mobile phones as a whole. This is quite extraordinary, well, unprecedented really, previous phase of history. And there is another feature to it, that this is the first time, so far as I know, that the most advanced technologies have gone straight to the poorest countries of the world. You look at Africa, for example, it has a higher ownership of mobile phones per head than any other continent, and the proportion of smartphones in Africa is accelerating in a dramatic way. They will catch up soon with the rest of the world. And I think if you look at what's happening in the world at the moment, you can see the implications of this. Consider the waves of migration. I just did this little interview with Kat, the superstar, before starting this lecture. We were talking about the waves of migrants coming to Europe, right? Well, I've been looking at what's going on, probably like some other people here. It's really, really interesting, because a very substantial proportion of migrants, especially the ones coming through the Balkans and from Afghanistan actually, are using iPhones or smartphones to track their progress. They're using GPS to find where they're going. You've had smugglers advertising on the internet a bit like travel agents. They give you a whole kind of series of videos on the country or the area you want to go to. The migrants can seek to outwit the authorities because they can follow what's going on. So I'd suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, this is 21st century migration. It's different from previous eras, because this is a world where no one is outside. It doesn't matter where you are. Most of you are going to have your iPhones poised on your lap, and I'd be very surprised if I don't see some people when I'm talking surreptitiously looking down. There may even be someone who's got them in their hand, because people walk along the street like it's a part of the body, and it is, in a way, a part of the body now, because you're so dependent on an integrator with it. You know, in the digital era, nothing, if you like, is invisible. And I think this is really different from the past. So migrants who came in the past, if they left one area, wouldn't have much information about the other area. When people migrated from Europe 75 years ago to North America, basically you were severing contact with your family. It was called the brutal bargain if you were a migrant. It took 6 weeks to get a letter, and it wasn't reliable. You multiply that, 12 weeks to get a letter back. You essentially couldn't keep in touch. Now, just think about it. You can keep in touch. You might be a Chinese migrant, let's say, with your family back home every day. You can see them on your iPhone or your iPad, and it costs nothing. Even 10 years ago, no one would have predicted that this is possible. What is true of migration is also true of Islamic State. Islamic State is at the core, as we know, of a conflict very uncomfortably close to us. Very well connected with migration, of course, because the Syrian civil war collapsed the regime in Libya and so forth. Look at what IS is. On the surface, it seems to be a theocratic medieval organization based on a hatred of women. I say so, an apparent hatred of women, or at least women's freedom. But at the same time, IS is using advanced digital technologies. It's actually pioneered, like the return of Foucault. Anyone here know Foucault? God, what have they been teaching you there? Well, Foucault argued that we're in an era of quiet punishment, which is hidden away. You know, we hang people in a kind of unobtrusive way. We used to, anyway. And he argued that exemplary punishment has gone away because of a lot of beheading in the European past. Well, ISIS have reinvented beheading for the digital age, as you know. They've had an enormous impact that way. So think of how bizarre this world is, because I could be in a debate in the Parliament about IS, and someone in a part of Syria who's a member of IS could behead somebody, send it off in a video, tune into iPlayer, and watch us debating IS in the House of Lords. There is no precedent for a world like that. IS is also using pretty advanced digital techniques on the battlefield. One of the reasons why it's become so entrenched. They employ a lot of sophisticated hackers and computer specialists who've joined up. So just as the migration, which is surging towards Europe, is 21st century migration, ISIS is 21st century terrorism, I would suggest to you. And this, we don't really know what the implications of that will yet be for coping with it, except it's pretty likely to be global, I think. For the same reason that everything is, in some sense, global today. Now, the core of my argument as a social scientist and as a politician is that the digital revolution and its consequences have been almost wholly unassimilated into the social sciences and into politics. All these things are going on, but we haven't really absorbed them into the core of our thinking in the social sciences, or indeed in the political domain. And there is a structural reason for that I want to suggest to you, which is that many people have misunderstood what the digital revolution is. That is because the reason why is that they identify the digital revolution with what I've just been talking about, with the internet. Now, the internet, as I've said, and social media. The internet and social media are indeed remarkable phenomena, for the reasons I just discussed. But this is not the core of the digital revolution. To me, it's not the driving force of the digital revolution. We understand what this force is and how we should grasp the digital revolution. We're not going to be able to fully understand its implications for so many areas of our academic work, so many areas of our personal life, and so many areas of politics. So what is the digital revolution? Well, to me, it is the relationship between three things, three processes, deeply interconnected, sweepingly changing all the time. The first is the internet, the second is supercomputers, and the third is robotics. The digital revolution is about the intricate connections between the internet, supercomputers, and robotics. And to me, supercomputers are the core of the whole thing. Supercomputers are at the heart of the digital revolution. And this is what I think has not been grasped by many people, it's everybody obviously, who works on these issues. Can I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, who has seen a supercomputer? What's the matter with you? They're sort of running your whole life. Well, I recommend that you do. I've been doing a lot of work on the frontiers of medicine involving these things. We've been quite a few times to see the supercomputer at Imperial College. I have to describe it to you because I hope it will stick in your mind. You go to where the supercomputer is, right? It's got about these big black cabinets. Each black cabinet has got 6 high-powered computers in it. It consists of 3 huge rooms, much, much bigger than this one. About 100 of these black cabinets. They look quite sinister. They've got green lights flashing on them, you know. 100 in each of these 3 rooms, 300 big black cabinets, each with 6 really high-powered computers, and all these computers are networked. They're all part of a single network. So what are you looking at, ladies and gentlemen? You're looking at a mind here. A mind which is able to do things which the human mind is not able to do, but which become so accustomed to that we don't recognize how much it's transforming our lives. Part of the reason is that the iPhone, or let's say the smartphone more generally, is itself today a supercomputer. It draws on the combined power, algorithmic power, of supercomputers around the world and GPS systems. The smartphone in your pocket is more powerful than the biggest supercomputer in the world of about 30 years ago. Reckoned to be about 4 or 5 times more powerful, this blooming device in your handbag or pocket, than the systems that sent people to the moon 50 or 60 years ago. And everybody has access to supercomputing power, not of the scale of a supercomputer itself, but something like it, because many of the things we do with our iPhones and our iPads and our digital devices depend on taken for granted huge algorithmic power. We've got so accustomed to it that we don't notice it, but it's generic. And we're on the edge of something more than that, because quantum computers are already on the horizon. There's one called D-Wave, which appears to be on the point of becoming functional. D-Wave is reckoned to be, depending on who you believe, 1,000 times faster than the biggest supercomputer in the world. As I'll argue at the end of what I have to say, watch out, mates, because something is happening here which is both perhaps a boon to human beings, but a threat to human beings. There are some forces here which have never existed before, to my knowledge anyway, which certainly around the edges, at the same time as they help us organize our day-to-day lives, are a threat to ourselves as human beings and to the civilization which we've created. The other thing is the connection between supercomputers and robotics, but just before moving on to that, I would like to emphasize that many people's views of what computers can do are now very archaic. I don't know how many people in the audience would share them, but many people think that a computer can never be creative, a computer could never write poetry, a computer could never master everyday language. All of these things are definitively wrong when you're talking about supercomputers. And remember that you all have access to supercomputing power, whether you know it or not, on a day-to-day basis. You may know that the IBM supercomputer Watson beat the world champion at chess as long ago as 1964. I think it was Kasparov. And that is sort of intuitively people can understand, because after all, chess is mathematical, isn't it? But the much bigger breakthrough occurred more recently, in 2011. A new IBM computer beat the world champions at a game called Jeopardy. Jeopardy is an ordinary language, general knowledge game of immense complexity, based on ordinary, everyday understanding of the world. No one, even 10 years before, no one thought that a computer had any chance of beating people, because this depends on everyday knowledge. But the computer simply swiped the two world champions, and they were the world champions in this game, out of the game. See, this is reckoned by most people, I think quite rightly, to be a fundamental transition Now supercomputers can write elegant music which even music experts can't distinguish from humanly created music. They can write programs themselves. They can translate languages more or less instantaneously and pretty accurately, well, with increasing accuracy. Anyway, this is unbelievable. If you don't, you have to think about it, do a bit of work on it. It is quite unbelievable. And there's a whole list of things. There's a very good book on some aspects of this called The Second Machine Age. The Second Machine Age, quite a famous one now. And in the beginning of the book, The Second Machine Age, there is a list of all things that people thought, like many ordinary people think, computers could never do. And now they can do all of them. At least supercomputers can do all of them. One of them was drive a car. Because driving a car is a fantastically complicated thing. But now everybody here will know that there are driverless cars, one of them, or some of them owned by Google, others being produced by indigenous car manufacturers, which are far safer than human drivers. The Google car is basically not yet in cities, it's on US freeways, but it's driven 400,000 miles with only 3 accidents, and that was when human beings crashed into the back of it. Apple announced yesterday they might move into car manufacture big time. You could have like a revolution in the nature of transport looming here. But it's not long ago that people would have thought this was wholly impossible. Just for your interest, some guy who's now, I can't remember, wrote a really intriguing book comparing science fiction in the 1960s with reality now. And reality now has outpaced science fiction in many, many areas. For example, Arthur Clarke, your generation won't remember him, but well, he produced the novella that led to the film 2001, if I remember it. I think that's correct. And he had a rudimentary anticipation of the internet in one of his science fiction stories. There was nothing like the sophistication, the internet, supercomputers and robotics which I'm describing. There's no way you can kind of exaggerate the enormity of these changes. To me, they have to be brought right into the centre of the social sciences and politics, not just treated as marginal. The third element is the advance of robotics, which I would suggest to you we've become so accustomed to that we don't notice it, but it is just as remarkable as the other two components of the digital revolution. I mean, I came here from my house in London today. I got in the underground. I used a card. I didn't see a person. What does the card do? Well, it's got a digital code on it. You don't even have to put it on the actual machine anymore. You can hold it at distance from the machine. That is remarkable. If you've never even thought of it, it's quite remarkable. I got into the tube, got out the other end, didn't see a person. Got some money out the hole in the wall, didn't see a person. Got my ticket on the machine, didn't see a person. Got on the train itself through the barrier, and so it goes. We kind of got accustomed to something which is truly remarkable, and is the intrusion of robotics into our lives. So you shouldn't think of robotics as simply humanoid robotics. It shades off into the endless automation of our lives. In another lecture, but I would like to mention it here, I think you should remember that virtually all money has now become digital. That is, again, unbelievable. Money, in a certain sense, doesn't exist anymore, except as digits in computers. The proportion of cash in the global economy, physical cash, is reckoned to be 2,000 times less than it was 20 years ago, although, of course, all estimates are guesswork. But the advent of digital money is something which we still don't fully understand, including its connections to the financial crisis. But it's easy to see what difference it makes, because let's say you've got your money in a tax haven. You don't any longer have to bundle up all the cash and take it in your suitcase. You can just instantaneously transmitted to the bank address in the tax haven or wherever you choose to keep it. Most people in the generation of most people sitting here have become sort of accustomed to this. You go into Starbucks, you may not, I mean some of you might never use cash for all I know. You go into Starbucks with your card, you should just think about it, how remarkable that is. How can you use a credit card all over the world? How can everybody use their credit cards and they still work? How can that happen? Because in the smallest kind of everyday transaction, there is like buried the extraordinary pace and nature of early 21st century civilization. Robotics is the same as automation, at least electronic automation, but physical robotics is also making enormous advances. This is one area that has got a lot of airplay over the last 10 years. People are sort of fascinated with robots, so you'll see plenty of articles about robotics in the newspapers. But it is bloody interesting because, when was it? It was about 20 years ago. I was sort of trying to get the LSE media department funded. I was trying to raise some money. I went to the Sony Corporation in Japan, and I spent some time with the head of Sony, Mr. Ide, and I was asking, what kind of televisions you producing and so on. And he said, no. The future of Sony is robotics, he said. It didn't actually work out quite that way, but he did show me a robot. And at that point, 20 years ago, the robot, excuse me, couldn't do anything. Couldn't go upstairs, walk, couldn't do much at all. But now there exist robots that can do almost all these things. Extremely mobile robots who can not only walk, but can run faster than human beings. And the diversity of things which robots can do is already amazing. You'll know there are humanoid robots in China and in Japan particularly. In Japan, they're trying to use them to care for older people, since Japan is a heavily aging society. But I can assure you, we're not far from a time when, I could be, say, talking to somebody in the audience, I won't pick anyone out, and I might have to ask them, are you a robot? Because the flesh and the rapid advance of techniques of replicating a flesh and blood appearance are also moving very dramatically. You might not know it, but there already are robot stand-up comedians. They sort of mimic what ordinary stand-up comedians do. So they scan your face to see what you're laughing at, and they register that, and then they adjust their pace of delivery and their humor, and they make up their own jokes. So, I mean, I'm going to tell you a robot comedian joke, but don't blame me if you don't laugh. I know lots of you have got iPhones and iPads, like I said. So the stand-up robot comedian joke is, I started having a date with an Apple device. It didn't work out because she was so selfish. She was always I this, I that, I the other. Well, I think for a robot it's not bad. And I think you should also remember the scope of robotics, because does everyone here know about the Rosetta spacecraft? Nobody does. Can't be true. It's the one the European Union launched that flew to a comet 300 million miles away. Don't you know about that? Yeah, it must do, yeah. It's about a year or two ago. It took 10 years to get there. It had to loop around the sun and our planet to accelerate. It got to the comet in question, which has some distinctive cosmological significance, and a robot landed on the comet and sent back material from the comet. It is also unbelievable because it was going, I can't remember, but like millions of miles an hour as it were. At the end, it landed on this bloody thing. sort of infinite distance away in space, and that was done by human beings like you and me. Hardly credible. It's actually done by European Union scientists, which is something. The European Union, you probably know, the robot landed on the comet, and then about half an hour later its battery ran out, you know that? So it couldn't send back anything until it got close to the sun again. But at the outer edge of what's happening, these things are truly, truly remarkable. Now, I'm not saying these things in order to be a technological determinist, and nobody should be. All technological revolutions, like the original Industrial Revolution, are social, economic, and political, because they reshape our lives, and we actively reshape what we do in relation to these technologies, just like everyone is here with their smartphone hidden under the desk. And what I want to argue is that there is something really deeply, deeply important going on here for anyone who wants to be at the center of the social sciences. It's essentially like the creation of a new kind of world, a new kind of society. And I want to call it it's not a very sort of elegant term, but the high opportunity, high risk society. We're moving into a world where we have opportunities which are undreamt of by previous generations. Not only because of the digital revolution, but in substantial part because of the digital revolution. One way of showing this, which as I mentioned earlier, I've been doing a lot of work on, is the frontiers of medicine. We, even in the next few years, will see revolutions in medicine, I believe, that no one has ever witnessed before. The reason is because of the overlap of the algorithmic power of supercomputers and genetics. A computer is just information, right? Our bodies are just information, too. Genetics is simply a code of information. And the overlap between these two is now very, very deep. And you can decouple genetic chains in a way in which you couldn't previously. I've been looking, I'm an amateur, but I've been looking at research on cancer, different kinds of cancers. And I just think there will be dramatic breakthroughs, not in the long term, but in the short term, within the next 10 years or so. Not predictable where, but they will be pretty fundamental. So I only use this as an example to say that the opportunity side of the digital revolution is huge. Huge, huge, huge. But so are the risks. And those risks overlap with other risks we face in 21st century society. The key thing to register is that we can't measure either these opportunities or the risks. The reason for this is that both on the opportunity side and the risk side, we're living in a world which, as I would put it, has moved off the edge of history. Many of the opportunities we have, no previous generation ever had, I think. Okay? Some of the risks and dangers we face, including the one I wrote my book before last on, climate change, is also a danger, human-induced climate change, that no other generation had to cope with because no other civilization intervened in nature on an everyday basis to the depth to which our civilization does. So we have huge opportunities, but we face huge risks, and you cannot in advance work out very easily at all what the relationship between them will be. This is a very, very edgy world we're moving into, I think. But I want to drive this point home. If you're running an insurance company, every time I get into a car, an insurance company can calculate, unfortunately, my chances of being in an accident. The reason for that is that you have a very large number of cases, past cases to go on. People are driving all the time. You can calculate the level of risk. In the case of the new opportunity, high risk society, you can only guess at the risks and guess at the opportunities beforehand because they both occupy new terrain and they interact with one another. really important to see they interact with one another. Because what is one of the big risks we face? Well, a global pandemic. Where could a global pandemic come from? It could come from scientific advances, paradoxically. There's a colleague of mine in the House of Parliament, Martin Rees, who used to be head of the Royal Society, wrote a very good book about this. Some of the most lethal new forms of disease in the world might come from inadvertent side effects of innovation in science, including some of the ones I just mentioned, genetic innovation, which might have unanticipated consequences. I don't know how far I can register this point, but this is a really new way of living history and living our personal lives when you have this intimate, complex fusion of a range of opportunities and a range of risks that are historically unique to our period of civilization. Not just industrial civilization, but pretty largely the 21st century, because these changes have been so compressed in time. Oh, bloody hell, so I was supposed to finish now. Barely started, really. Well, I'll sort of zoom on a bit. I just want to discuss then quickly how all these things impinge on core areas of the social sciences. And I'll just mention three of them quickly. One is politics and democracy. These are being transformed, I think, before our eyes. There are many things involved, but the digital revolution in its various domains is certainly a core one. There's a very good book by Robert Putnam, the political scientist at Harvard, and a woman called Susan Farr, called Disaffected Democracies. It shows that in 18 democratic countries, you're finding the same thing. People disillusioned, many of them, with existing democratic mechanisms, suspicious of political leaders, feel distant from parliaments, feel parliaments are moved too slowly. I'm not suggesting there is a simple reason for this, but it's clearly structural. And I do think, and I think it can be pretty well demonstrated, aspects of the digital revolution are deeply involved in this. If you've got a smartphone in your handbag or pocket, you've got access to virtually all of the global information that human beings possess. You're used to doing it quickly. You can live a just-in-time life. Political institutions seem creaky and slow compared to that. To me, therefore, I don't have time to develop it, but I think we have to have a renewed bout of experiments with democracy, including experiments with direct democracy to see whether it can plug it up, because I think there are serious problems of disaffection which are arising because of the lack of coordination between our everyday lives and our political institutions. And I don't think it's at all surprising, because, again, I'd like to drive it home. You've got a smartphone in your pocket. You can live a just-in-time existence the whole time the way you never could before. So if you're going somewhere in a city, you don't need to take a map. You don't even need to look beforehand. You can just check it on your smartphone. More or less anything you want to do, you can just check it and do it. That's a just-in-time life, which is pretty distant from the kind of slow and fumbling nature of traditional politics, I think. Second, the economy and inequality. We have really deep changes happening in the economic system. Not all, again, driven by the digital revolution, but some, for sure, they are driven by the digital revolution. And the implications are, again, absolutely huge. Some of the social scientists sitting in the front here will know the work of Carl Frey, F-R-E-Y, and other workers at the Martin Institute, University of Oxford. Frey did a detailed statistical study of the US labor market, and he came up with the conclusion that nearly 50% of existing jobs in the the US labour market, and therefore ours, are vulnerable to takeover by a mixture of supercomputers and robotics. The previous generation It was the intrusion of robots into the making of things, deindustrialization. There is a car factory in California, the Tesla factory, where there isn't a single worker, but many human worker, but there are many other car factories. Most of them now depend on robots to do a lot of their production. But we're talking about the disappearance of middle-class jobs, professional jobs, translators, technical specialists, the lawyers, low-level lawyers, a whole range of jobs. The study was a pretty detailed one. There have been many others of a similar kind carried out. The implications obviously gigantic. Now what we don't know, I mean, it's pretty sure that a lot of these jobs will disappear. Pretty sure, I think, that is. What we don't know is whether new jobs will be created to replace them, which is possible because there may be areas of life where people can make money we haven't even thought of yet. There may be, but it's a serious, serious issue which we all have to work on, because if the jobs are not replaced, we're going to have to restructure welfare systems. We're going to have to rethink possibly the idea of basic income. Everybody gets some kind of basic income that was pioneered in the 1960s as a way of transforming how welfare benefits would relate to such a huge swathe of change. There is a second implication of robotics in invading white-collar and professional jobs. It's a big deal for you, because those are the kind of jobs everyone here is expecting to go into. Some of the jobs will be pretty high-level jobs, not just routine jobs in any real sense, I think. The second issue, really fundamental one, is social mobility. If you look at what happened to my generation, my dad worked on the London Underground, and I somehow squeezed into a reasonable school, God knows how, because I wasn't good at anything, wasn't good at school, wasn't good at university, nothing like that, but somehow I kind of got on in the world. And the large reason for that was the existence of the welfare state, and fundamentally, however, the fact that new jobs have been created. What's so a shame is that virtually all of the social mobility in the second half of the 20th century was what they call absolute rather than relative. That is, it was because of the expansion of white-collar work and the process of deindustrialization, the disappearance of blue-collar work, relative disappearance of blue-collar work. And we could get better jobs because those jobs opened up. Now think about what seems to be happening currently, which is exactly the reverse of this. In social mobility, not many people from the top move down to the bottom. Nearly all social mobility is structural in that sense. Now you have an obverse situation now. Instead of an expansion of white-collar and professional jobs, we like to get very systematic and perhaps dramatic and perhaps pretty short-term contraction of those jobs. So what's going to happen to people at the bottom? So again, a gigantic issue to think through for all of us. So, I mean, my first two fields, politics and democracy, you could say a hell of a lot more than I've got time to. The same thing about the economy and inequality. Inequalities at the very top in our society, one of the worst aspects of the world we create. That's deeply involved with electronic money for the reasons I had mentioned earlier. You can just take it all over the world, and you've got a sort of elite of super rich who are themselves global and depend on electronic money. The third element I'd mentioned is the transformation of war. I do have to mention it because it's so fundamental. The digital revolution, as I tried to stress, is a problematic, unknown mixture of opportunity and risk, but it certainly has a heavy malign side. And one, I think, is the actual direct transformation of war, which is advancing in most domains of warfare and is advancing very rapidly. Everyone here will know about drones. There's a very, really sort of soulful book on the use of American drones in rural areas of Pakistan called the thistle on the drone, The Americans send the drones over to kill people who are suspected terrorists. The people who are the suspected terrorists and the others who no doubt not, that get killed, can see nothing. They don't know where it's coming from. There's no way of knowing who will be struck down. But the people who are running the drones from somewhere in Arizona or in some kind of porter cabin, they sit there. They've got infrared cameras on the one type of drone. They say they know more about the people they're going to kill than they know about their neighbors. There's an immediate, like lethal contact between the least developed, almost stone age cultures of the world and the most advanced age of digital technology. But again, it is only the very beginning. Our battlefield robots are already here. They're going to be the next generation of fighting forces. God knows what that will actually mean. But you know, most big inventions came from war. This was true of the internet. It was true of most things I'm describing. GPS, for example, on which a lot of supercomputing power utilizes, was invented by the Americans as a way of blunting the rise of Soviet power when the Soviets got into space before the Americans did. Now we use it to find our way to the nearest restaurant, but it was driven by war. But sociologically speaking, you know, we must keep abreast of how these things will transform the nature of organized violence. And again, I think we're only in the beginning. Well, in conclusion, you'll be pleased to know that I'm getting to the conclusion. When did I start? 4:10, didn't I? Anyway, I do have a conclusion, which is you ain't heard anything yet. These transformations might seem gigantic. To me, they are. They're really, really imponderable. But there perhaps are even more profound changes looming than these. For that, I have to take you back to the image of the supercomputer with all the black boxes forming a sort of gigantic supermind. There is now a serious discussion among information scientists, sociologists, and philosophers about what is called singularity. Singularity means the point at which human beings will lose their nature as human beings, either become so modified and integrated with machines that it will be a different phase of evolution, or become superseded by intelligent machines who, combined with robotics, will outpace who we are and what we are as human beings. This might seem just fanciful futurism, but it absolutely is not. The best person, singularity is worth keeping in your mind. Singularity is the point at which intelligent machines outpace human beings in most areas of our lives. If you're interested, there's a singularity hub on the internet, which is like a global debate of these issues. One of the biggest transformative forces in science, by the way, is open source data used by scientists on a global level to talk to each other and share data in a way they never could before. All these things are kind of entangled with one another. My guru for all this is Ray Kurzweil, 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 California information scientist who is now the chief scientific advisor to Google, actually. And Kurzweil wrote this famous book about 10 years ago called The Singularity is Near. By the singularity is near, he means that by about perhaps even the year 2030, 2040, intelligent machines could not only surpass us, but we could become transformed as human beings. He speaks of the possibility of immortality. And you'll be pleased to know, younger people sitting here, potentially in a lifetime, of people who are alive now. The most recent book is called Live Long to Live Forever. Well, it ain't going to affect me, mate, but it could affect one of you in this room. It sounds ridiculous, and many people dispute his conclusions. But the point is we don't know. And to me, they are quite realistic possibilities. They're like part of the high opportunity, high risk society. We just do not know, but it is an imminent possibility that in a generation, our relationship to the non-material world could be completely transformed. If you think that's daft, please don't, because consider how many parts of the human body can already be replaced. Many people here, you know, well, older ones will have bits and pieces replaced. You only have to consider a substantial step beyond that, which could be the ability to download most of the components of the brain on a supercomputer. The US and the EU each have billion-dollar projects to simulate the brain on a computer, supercomputer. Imagine what you could do with that if you could then clone human bodies. Well, you can clone human bodies. The technology exists to clone human bodies. But you don't necessarily have to have that avenue. You could have any avenue of integration of these changes, transforming the nature of what it means to be a human being. So this is my concluding point. The 21st century is not going to look like the closing years of the 20th century. It's going to be probably more jagged, perhaps more conflict-full, more unpredictable, even than the 20th century was. And I think we're already a bit into that age. We're living through a period which is fractured, which is uncertain, where we don't quite know where the world is going. I'm not saying, again, in any way these are the only forces, but they are quite deeply implicated. And history might not look the same as it had previously. So, you know, I'd ask you to say, to think anyway, our civilization kind of hangs in the balance. On the one hand, you have these huge new risks. I mean, if anybody doubts, I can assure you that human-induced climate change is real. It is a real threat to the continuity of our civilization. It is not just a distant threat, because it overlaps with other unique features of our era, which also constitute risk as well as opportunities. These are huge population growth. 1850, less than 1 billion people in the world. We're moving towards a world with at least 10 billion people. Many sources of water scarcity, food scarcity, a whole lot of overlapping new global risks. The reason why climate change is much more dangerous than many people think is because it overlaps with these other risks. If you doubt that, watch the American TV series called The Years of Living Dangerously. It starts with a Syrian civil war. Actually, long before the civil war got to the stage it is now, and argues that climate change, especially increasing aridity, lack of water, driving movement of populations, was one, anyway, of the sources of the Syrian civil war. To me, climate change is like a here and now issue because it overlaps with all these other risks. So it's not too much to say that, you know, we're suspended between, for the first time ever, I think, the possibility of Armageddon at the outer edge of risk anyway, because nuclear weapons are another factor in the equation. It's no longer impossible that our civilization could largely destroy itself on the one hand, and immortality on the other. Well, Armageddon and immortality, ladies and gentlemen, were the properties of the gods in the past. And we are not good. We are not gods. So we don't actually know, in this point of our history, whether we can handle the forces that we have ourselves created. It's an open issue how these things will overlap. There aren't many climate change jokes, but I'll try one on you. To conclude with, you'll be pleased to know, two planets are talking to one another, right? And the first planet, Oh, I don't feel very well. I think I've got Homo sapiens. The other planet says, don't worry, that doesn't last very long. That's the situation we possibly find ourselves. Thank you very much for your
Once again, thank you for that. We do have a couple of minutes for questions, so if you have a question, we'd like to raise a hand. I'm going to pick a couple.
Is there a microphone going around, isn't there?
Jeff Beacon, anyway. Even with these supercomputers, we don't really know what's going to happen with the climate, and it's probably a lot worse than...
Possibly. Yeah.
It's probably a lot worse than if you look up stuff than the official line. Certainly what they're saying. Now the way out of this, without any of your overlaps, the way out of the AI revolution destroying jobs and the gig stuff as well is for growth. And your colleagues in the Lords will all talk about green growth, though it's possible. But the remaining carbon budget, according to the slightly conservative IPCC, isn't very large. And you have to imagine unimaginable levels of decarbonisation of production to actually allow growth at all. So if we've got the AI revolution cutting the value of labour, like the microprocessor revolution did in the 80s, and we've got a limit to growth without really screwing the environment, what suggestions do you have?
Well, I mean, I spend my life working on that issue, a large chunk of it, so I've got lots. But I mean, I think what I'd like to register in the mind of the audience, that to me, this is our world, you know, and therefore, this is going to be your lives. You have to live through all this for its benefits and its problems, and absolutely cannot say how things will pan out. So far as the digital revolution goes and climate change, a really crucial, complicated set of issues. I mean, I don't think an awful lot will come from the Paris meetings about, you know, Paris meetings on limiting climate change. There's 21st meetings to do this. Nothing has been accomplished so far. More might be accomplished this time, but you'd have to be a bit dubious. What has happened that's worthwhile is that China has at last come seriously on board with real plans, I think, partly because of local pollution, to transform its energy systems, and Obama is trying to make climate change a lead factor in the continuing part of his presidency. So bilateral negotiations might lead to something significant. But all of this is pretty deeply intertwined with the digital revolution, I think, because I used to think that, you know, fossil fuels are the main source of the greenhouse gases that are causing our climate to warm. Yeah? Do not doubt it. Climate change is unequivocal. The risks are unequivocal. The fact that it's caused by human beings is unequivocal. If you look at the scientific findings, what we don't know is like a deep uncertainty about just how huge the risks are. But you can't write off, you know, deep existential risks. Well, you can see some interesting potential connections between the digital revolution and progressive environmental politics. Rather than the analog, for example, what happened in Africa with iPhones and phone systems, African countries jumped the phase of fixed telephone lines and went straight to mobile phones and smartphones. We need to try and make sure they jump the phase of fossil fuel industries and go directly to renewables. Now, what we need to have is the application of the digital revolution to new ways of storing energy, renewable energy. There are big advances going on in most forms of renewable energy. They're much cheaper than they used to be, pretty good performance. The main problem is storage. Elon Musk in California is a famous innovator, has invented a home battery which looks pretty significant, which will store energy for a 24-hour cycle. My brother lives in California. His whole house is heated by solar power. His car is an electric car. He sells energy back to the grid. But if you could find a way of storing on a large scale, energy on a large scale, which I think would have to be a digitally driven thing, you could, as it were, I think, undermine the fossil fuel.
Could it be done faster?
I used to think
can you possibly do it faster?
Because
carbon dioxide is accelerating. We haven't got the budget left to do it.
Well, it's very possible. I'm not going to dispute that, but I thought you were looking for sources of hope. No, I mean the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up.
The hope is to cut production.
It's now above 400 parts per million.
To degrowth.
It hasn't been. Well, you say degrowth, but if you're a poverty-stricken person living in India and you want a better life, that's not so easy.
We pay them.
So that's because the problems are huge. We're not going to in any way deny that.
Any more quick short questions? Wait, do you have a question?
Yes. What do you think about becoming immortal?
Pardon?
What do you think about becoming immortal?
About?
Becoming immortal.
You mean me? Do you mean as an analytical question or personal question?
If the robotics continue developing, we could become immortal.
Well, I think Kurzweil is right. That is, for the first time in the history of our race, immortality is a real possibility. But of course it could take many different forms. It wouldn't necessarily mean you living for an awful long time in your existing body in any sense. It might be a very different, mutant form of being. But I would entirely accept the argument that this is within the realm of possibility. That's all one has to say. I don't think anyone knows. You couldn't put a date on it and say, like he does, I think, in 40 years' time this will have happened. But you can say it's quite likely to have happened, because one of the things I didn't talk about all that much is just the wholesale acceleration of innovation. It's driven by a lot of these things. And you can track that in some point. I mentioned cancer research, but there are plenty of other areas that overlap with the human body. The thing to do is have a look at one or two of Kurzweil's writings, or look at the Singularity Hub, and you can see what people are saying about these things. I mean, that's bloody interesting. What we're talking about, a bit like climate change, is heavy levels of uncertainty. That's my point about the high opportunity, high risk society. We're in different terrain. You can't calculate risk or opportunity in the same way as in the past in these areas. Therefore, we're all reduced to a kind of guesswork among some of the most fundamental things which will potentially even destroy our civilization. So that's a huge, huge transition, I think, in human history.
Oh,
One last final question.
yes, just one question. I think listening to you and also Ray Kurzweil is a little bit on the optimistic side. You haven't addressed seems like the dark side of when you have a supercomputer with an IQ of 1200 and a human being with an IQ of 130. The difference between a supercomputer and a mouse, or us and a mouse, and the difference between a supercomputer and us. The supercomputer is going to be making many of these decisions.
Well,
and can make them.
I thought I had precisely addressed the dark side, because that's what I'm saying. This is this, historically unique, unpredictable fusion of huge opportunity and existential risk. The risks for us are existential.
Yes,
and even if you just confine yourself to the internet, there's the deep web, and in the deep web, nobody quite knows what's going on, but a lot of it's hellishly noxious. I mean, people sometimes ask me whether I'm a pessimist or optimist, and I can't find any way of answering that question because we're in don't know territory.
Yeah.
We're facing new risks and new opportunities with no way of giving a statistical form to them, or not much of a way. So whatever I say about the future could be altered almost in an instant, and this will be true of all of us. This is, I think, a new form of civilization in a way, because it's so different from the past because of the immense powers that we've unleashed, and they can be used for good and they can be used for ill, but at the outer edge they're existential for us. We could, at the outer edge of risk, and I say only the outer edge of risk, we could destroy large chunks of our civilization. I mean, even a nuclear confrontation would do that. The nuclear weapons, you know, each nuclear weapon the Russian has, they're facing the US in Syria as we speak. You'd be mad not to think that this is dangerous. Is, I think, about 50 or 60 times more destructive power than Hiroshima or the nuclear weapons of the Second World War. Hiroshima killed an estimated 150,000 people. This time they're talking about millions. It's very eerie when the world has overtaken science fiction, very eerie, and I understand why it's really hard to think it, you know, but it is it. This is the world we've somehow, whether we like it or moved into, you know, it intersects with the past, so it's not all new, you know. It intersects with history, as you can see from Islamic State, for example. The cutting edge of change intersects with deeply rooted historical conflicts, well, like Russia trying to reassert itself on the world stage. But those risks are real. Now, at the outer edge, they're just so dangerous you can't really chart them. No. But the opportunities are a bit the same. So I just think it's like a different world we're coming into, and the younger generation here is going to have to pioneer their way through it. And I'm not saying that one has the primacy of the other, because I think these apply to deeply personal life. You know, personal life has been transformed by the digital revolution. You have a different way of sorting out your identity, sexuality, so forth. We're again all experimenters with this. There we go. I knew that would happen. It took longer than I thought. But I mean, that's a good signifier, perfect signifier of what I'm talking about. You just got an email of some sort. The other side of the lecture I would give is transformation of personal life, the emotions, sexuality, gender identity. Think of the emergence of transgender, and think of how deep that's involved with conflict, because you know, Mr. Putin has asserted a fairly traditionalist view of morality. It's got anti-gay laws. ISIS has an extreme form of this. They push gay people off parapets. So, you know, these things intersect, the sort of personal, emotional changes and global futures, and it is again the digital revolution that is at least the means of this. So the personal changes, we're all like pioneers in some new kind of life for our own identities, I think.
No problem.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I'm a bit ill because I had like dental operation, so I did quite well actually. Thank you for your attention again anyway.
To just remind all SPS students to actually sign in on the register on the left. And also, don't forget to put up and think your book, Turbo on the Mighty Continent.
By the way, before everyone goes, can I just say one mustn't succumb to the digital revolution. A lot of our future will be back to the future type future. So I'm using PowerPoint to give this speech. After the motor car, back to walking, back to running, back to cycling. Don't simply succumb to the digital revolution. If you want to protect your passwords, write them down on a piece of paper, keep them in a locked cupboard in your office, the only way that you can do it.